welcome everyone. My name is Laura Fey. I'm located at Leuphana University in Germany, and I'm the engagement officer for the ODC division. And one of the things that we as a division like to do is these kind of webinars to different type of topics, and you can basically bring topics forward that you're interested in. So today we are looking into researching change with ethnographic methods, and Nina is going to introduce herself in a bit. So Nina is going to talk about her research, and then it's going to be pretty interactive in terms of that you can ask your questions and what you really like to know. And you can, of course, do this through raise your hand or through putting something in the chat. We have Magali, who's going to introduce herself in a second too, who's going to monitor the chat and make sure that any question you put in there we'll be able to take into account. Other than that, maybe in regards to house rules, we are recording this meeting. You might have seen this notification when you joined. This is because we are making these recordings available for people that cannot join us but are interested in this conversation. If you do not like to be recorded, please either switch your camera off or take your name out. So this is up to you. Other than that, I would now hand over to Magali and mute myself. And then after Magali, we hand over to.
Okay, thank you, Laura. So hi, everyone. Very happy to have all of you here today. So I am Magali from the ODC Division. I am from France. And today I am in charge of a webinar and also active in the ODC division, and today I am in charge of the chat box. So that means that if you have some questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and I will ask Nina if needed. So thank you. Nina, it's up to you.
And I will do my very best to answer them, but we'll see how that goes. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy that you're joining us today. I'm Nina, and I'm employed in Aalborg University. I'm also part of the ODC division. I was elected into the program in the board, and I just was very thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you guys today about researching change with ethnographic methods. So the agenda for today, very, very briefly, I'm going to talk about how I study change processes with ethnographic methods. I'm going to bring an example of what I've done and what I think I learned. And I'm going to talk about what I think are the main issues and big challenges for people who work with change or study change. So hopefully the examples and the points that I bring will be relevant for you guys, regardless of if you are sort of a more traditional academic researcher or if you are also a practitioner, but you work with change in your own organization. Of course, the examples I bring are from my own research, but I hope that together we can sort of expand it and talk about the issue much more broadly. I've also tried to save some space for questions and discussion because in my experience, this is where it really becomes interesting. So I hope you're bringing stuff from your own work and things you're interested in and would love to discuss much more with us today. So just a tiny bit about my background. I'm a qualitative researcher, as you might have guessed. I've studied healthcare work since 2009. So this is my empirical domain. So my examples will be from healthcare. But I've always studied organizational aspects, leadership, managerial work, change coordination, and so on and so forth. I have been in quite a lot of different empirical fields, and I think that's been helpful over time for me as a change researcher, and we can talk a little bit about that later. And maybe it's also making me sort of blind to other things because I've sort of spread across the different specialties. We can discuss that as well. So I've been in acute care, emergency medical services, oncology, which is cancer treatment, different medical wards, different surgical wards, diagnostic imaging, and also studied inter-organizational projects. So as you can see, I love doing field work. It's a really important way for me to sort of keep my curiosity as a researcher, but also it's a place for me to actually start thinking theoretically also. My approach to change is that it's a normal condition of organizational life, to quote Zuckers and Cheers, and I've always approached stability and continuity as something that requires effort. That's also obvious in this literature. And I'm saying that because I think that's very important, that I just really specify what is the approach, the theoretical approach to change that I'm working with. So you can see how it relates to how you want to do this, and or maybe see what might be relevant or not so relevant for you. I work with case study designs. I think it's how my brain works. This is how I think about research. I've studied variety, comparison, longitudinal case studies, short-term theoretically focused. I've done practice-based research. I usually use the method of shadowing. So I follow the work practices, I follow the object. I do many different forms of interviews. And because the empirical domain of healthcare in Denmark is a public sector, there are tons of documents regulating work and governing the practices. So document analysis has always also been an important part of the work that I do. And in the work that I do, change is always there. Even though the project is not specifically designed as a change project, change is there. Of course, this relates to my theoretical approach, but it's also just something that is very visibly empirically when you do this kind of research. So sometimes I foreground it, and other times change is actually the background. And this is, of course, an analytical distinction that I make, and I have to outline and I have to argue for and explain to the reader what is actually the change in this project, and is change a background, or is it the stuff that I'm foregrounding? And I'm going to come back to that a little bit. So this is a busy slide, I know, but it's an example from some work that I've done, and I'm just going to go through it very quickly, but to give you a little bit of sort of a shared reference that we might be able to speak from, and something where you also might be able to relate the stuff that you think is interesting to see what are the overlaps or the differences. So as my postdoctoral work, I did a longitudinal comparative case study of a mandated change in the Danish healthcare sector. So hospital wards had to organize for coherent patient pathways. So this was not optional, it was mandatory. And I was fortunate enough to be part of a big research practice collaboration. So I was the researcher, and there was a developmental part of it, and there was three big clinical wards. It was sort of inspired by engaged scholarship by Van der Ven. And I was shadowing the efforts to produce organizational coherence in patient pathways across professional, disciplinary, organizational, and geographical boundaries. And I don't know if you get the sense already, but it was a big task. And I'm very happy I did this work, but it was also a very, very steep learning curve. So the wards had the same mandated change task, but they have different clinical organizational context. But they actually reported some similar organizational challenges, which is not surprising when you know healthcare, right? They reported that it was challenging to make coherent patient pathways because of the fragmentation, the siloed work, because of unpredictability and variation in day-to-day work. And this is not surprising in healthcare, right? We talk about a predictable unpredictability. It was particularly difficult also, they addressed, to go from formal agreements to collaboration in practice. And as an organizational researcher, I, of course, thought, oh, okay, this is interesting. Let's see how this goes. And then they also really talked about the pace of work and accelerated pathways, which was also a change tendency in healthcare at this point, that the admission days were being shortened, much more work was being outpatient, allocated to outpatient clinics, and pathways were accelerated. So I had this very simple idea for a very simple design that, of course, does not show the whole story at all, but I'm just going to share it with you. So in the first phase, year one, I spent a lot of time mapping current practices in the emergency department, in the medical ward, and in the oncology ward. And they were chosen to represent sort of organizational context where I knew from the coordination literature that this was going to be difficult. I could have chosen on the other side of that spectrum, for instance, elective surgery that is very standardized and relatively predictable because people are already diagnosed when they arrived. but I wanted to find the cases where I expected this to be particularly difficult, because I also wanted it to represent some of the very big sort of chunks of healthcare work, right? Emergency departments, where a lot of us come in when we're injured or ill, medical wards, where we are if we are admitted, and then the oncology ward, which actually ended up relating to the medical ward and emergency department, because oncology patients are admitted to medical wards for side effects, or if they're acutely ill, they arrive in the emergency department. So already my neatly sort of categorized 3 different departments actually ended up being very muddy. Anyway, the phase 2 was me shadowing the developmental practices that the clinicians and the consultants did. And then in phase 3, I was hoping to be able to see how they tried to stabilize the different solutions that they were coming up with. So I conducted fieldwork in all 3 wards for 3 years. That was all I did. This was the one project I had. I had no teaching. This was just it. Yeah. And my main challenge was to shadow change in changing contexts over time. There was no stability here. Stuff was changing under my feet as I was doing this. And I started out thinking, okay, I need to give myself an opportunity to sort of revise and refine what I think I know. So I did explorative pilot studies for each of the different wards, made site visits to the wards and the units, talked to people in different work functions, tried to establish and qualify where and when the work was practiced and by whom. And a key issue here was that it's very well known from the literature that coherence and continuity, patient continuity, is something that people usually pay attention to when it's not there. Which I'm guessing you can see then what that presents a problem when you want to study something that people usually notice when it's not there or it's not working. So anyway, I used drawings during these phases and during interviews to try to understand the interdependence and flow of work and patient pathways. I've brought some examples. I then went back to the clinical partners with this idea of what I wanted to do and asked them to really sort of push me. Like, who else should I shadow? Where else should I go? What am I missing? And that really, really helped me. Because of course I wasn't able to sort of pre-plan everything, and because I didn't have the overview of what I was going to study before I studied it, this was really helpful. Then I adjusted the plan and did the 3 phases of fieldwork, where I shadowed doctors and nurses and therapists and managers and did lots of interviews. But I learned that because these people were changing the organization of their work as I was studying them, I had to do the pilot studies again before each next phase, because what I had studied in phase 1 had been reorganized, and some of the important efforts had been moved or changed or allocated to different work functions. So actually, the stuff that I was following in real time really, really called for this adjustability, sort of flexibility in the design. Yeah. And then I also did desk research, just as this sort of recurrent side stream of my research. I had to study the different changes that arrived from policy and governance and economic changes. For instance, there were some really big policy changes made in Denmark during these 3 years, and they had a huge impact of some of this stuff. Yes. So this is a very busy drawing, but I just wanted to show you what does it look like then when I'm actually drawing. This is, as you can see, it's a translated version, so it's not the original Danish drawing, but it's sort of an aggregated drawing from all the different versions that I did during the interviews. So what I did was super simple. I just asked the person I was talking to tell me, like, where do your patients come from? So let's use Laura as an example. If Laura is the doctor or the nurse or the therapist in the medicine unit that I'm studying, I would say, Laura, so when you see patients, where do they come from? Where have they been before? And Laura would say, well, they come from their general practitioner, and they refer them into the emergency ward. A lot of my patients are elderly patients, so they will also arrive from their nursing home or their pre-hospital out-of-hours doctors. of course, some of them might also be super ill, but recovering, and then they're transferred from the intensive care unit into my unit. And then Laura is drawing all these different pathways and different people that she's collaborating with. And then I ask her, well, where do they go when you're done seeing them? And Laura will draw where they go after she's seen them. And as you can see, people then started making little scribbles and sort of, okay, but this is difficult. You can see that this is where there's sort of a nudge or a sort of a nub of things that are really difficult. This medical visitation, that's difficult. Or lack of resources. We don't have enough linoleum after 4 p.m. And that's code for not enough floor. And that's code for not enough spaces to actually have beds and people be able to lie in these beds. So these were some of the ways that I would use drawings during this more explorative phase to map out and understand how the work was related. Because when I study change in a setting where work is interdependent, one change, one little place in this super complex map, of course, has consequences throughout the system. So I needed to understand the map before I could understand the changes. So, super quick version of this. What do I think I learned from this? I learned that I needed a theoretical approach to change that I could operationalize into a working design. Right? I needed to understand what do I think change is, what is changing in my project, and how will I know this when I start doing the fieldwork? And I think that was so important in my empirical context where so many different sources of different kinds of change are just jumbled up together in this very complex setting. So I really tried to help myself sort of make these analytical distinctions and sort of cuts. I'm not looking at everything. I'm not looking at all the different policy and all the different clinical standards that are changing. I'm focusing on this. I'm trying to understand this. But of course, that also gave me the challenge of figuring out how am I going to understand and study context. If these change processes that I shadow are so important, what is the context for this, right? We know from the change research that change and context are so important, but we also know from a lot of this work that context is under-theorized. It's understood as this sort of background, relatively stable background. And I had already started working with that on the basis of my PhD, but it was really helpful for me to start thinking about how do I operationalize and study context as also something dynamic. Because that was my empirical experience from doing this fieldwork. There was not this stable background context that I could rely on as sort of what would provide meaning for the change that I was researching. Of course, some things were kept stable, but they were also sort of stabilized by a lot of work that people did. Yeah. So I continually thought to sort of refine my understanding of what it is that I was actually studying. I think I would now call it, I would really trying to understand the casing of what I was doing, right? How do I case this also theoretically? I was looking empirically at people who were trying to produce coherence, and I was reading into the literature, in the leadership literature and coordination research and the stuff I had done on my PhD, so I could operationalize it. How will this look, right? When I'm doing this fieldwork over 3 years in 3 different wards, what am I going to pay attention to? How will efforts to produce coherence look, right? Some things might look super simple. There was not a clinical guideline for admitting this patient before, there is now. Does that count? If so, is that as do I code this as a sort of a structural solution, and so on and so forth. So I had to really work to operationalize this. And of course, the stuff I thought I was going to see in the beginning, I had to adjust that as well, right? I'm in this very sort of a clinical world where a lot of the stuff that is sort of acknowledged and counted and that counts in the system. One of the key things that came out of this developmental work and the change that these people started to develop was that the relational aspects were so significant. That's not a surprise for people who work with organizational theory, but for a lot of the clinicians, this was quite an important and significant outcome of their work. And what I could see was that this relational aspects of work, the importance of establishing relationships for developing change, but also for maintaining the change, trying to stabilize the change, was so important, but also not really recognized in the system. The people who were doing it were recognizing it, but it was not recognized in the formal system. So it was what Susan Lee Starr and Jeffrey Bauker would call functionally invisible. Another thing I learned was that I really needed a systematic approach to producing not only my field notes, but also reflective memos and drawings, keeping a record of my thinking and theorizing along the way. And that was really important for me because it was a relatively long change study. So I was there for 3 years, and my thinking and my understanding of what I think I was sort of studying changed a lot. So in order to sort of keep a record of how my thinking changed, I did memos, which is just, it's what it is. It's what it sounds like. It's just reflective memos. So whenever I came back from about a field work, or whenever I thought, okay, there's something here, my sort of analytical ear is scratching, I would make a memo. Some of them were super important for data analysis later on, and some of them were not. I couldn't know at the time, but it was such a important part of the systematic approach to sort of grappling with something that's so sometimes fluffy and challenging to study. So looking back now, I can also see that a really important thing I learned in this work and that I've kept on doing is working with my understanding of change, context, and casing throughout a research process. I used Eisenhardt's approach to case study designs and selecting and casing. I think she has some really good sort of questions you can ask yourself, like, why are you choosing this and why are you choosing that? And if you choose this, then what will that give you? What will that allow you to know something about, to theorize something about? I also really like Monica Krause's point about the distinction between the two aspects or dimensions of research projects, the objects. The material research object, what it is you are sort of studying, you have your methods, you produce your data, but also the epistemic target, right? What a given study aims to understand better. And that has really helped me, this distinction between the empirical material research object that I'm studying. I'm studying some specific concrete actions and organizations of meetings and productions of shared guidelines and whatever it is these people are doing. But I'm also trying to understand coherence, right? This organizational coherence that they're trying to produce across boundaries. And I'm trying to understand that theoretically. Yeah. And then the last thing that I found really helpful was Elvesen and Sandberg's paper on constructing research phenomenon. Of course, I didn't have these resources back when I did this work, but in my work with change research since, I've really, really benefited from these resources. Elvesen and Sandberg's paper, super briefly, just talks about the art, I think they call it the practice of constructing your research phenomenon, establishing what it is that you're going to go and research. So they're sort of recognizing that we're using our pre-understandings and our engagement with the empirical field and our theories to establish or construct what it is that we're going to study. Yeah, so this is a very early draft of, you can see me drawing. I made vignettes, I made visualizations, I made these drawings also as part of the data analysis. In this very, very simple drawing, you can see I'm trying to tease out based on my material. So what is the sort of vertical alignment efforts and what are the horizontal alignment efforts? Because I could see already after, I think, year 2, that because hospitals are these massive organizations that are also hierarchical, but patient pathways cut across these hierarchical structures, their efforts to produce coherence had to be aligned both horizontally and vertically. And I was trying to figure out how might this look? What might the components be? How might I sort of understand this in more sort of detail? And because it was also this engaged scholarship logic, I went back to the people who had been part of the research in iterations and went to morning conferences and staff meetings and afternoon seminars and so on and so forth, wherever they would give me, I don't know, 15 minutes, half an hour to present some of this work and get their feedback and get their questions and get sort of discussion going. And that was very, very helpful for me. And actually, some of the drawings were some of the objects that they were most interested in. For me, it was also a good sort of that you could later use as data displays to make the reader able to see some of the richness of what it is that you think you've studied. But it was also really important for me to sort of start the analysis. Like, what is this actually about? Can I write a vignette or a thick description of what this situation or this specific aspect of the change is? And then I try to really focus on details and on the language with which I wrote, because it became clear to me that this is where some of the particularities that might be important for the empirical part of the analysis is. And some of these might be important to share for the reader to understand what I want to say theoretically. If it's too sort of distant from the fieldwork, I think as a reader, I know I always sort of struggle. My first comment as a reviewer or a reader would be, Magali, why didn't you share more with this richness in the fieldwork and how you used it and where you could see this and how you understood that? So I tried to, of course, that's also a big ask, but I tried to sort of produce this. I'm done in a short while, so you can ask your questions, but I just want to talk a little bit about the distinction between the change and the context. And for me, that's one of the most important things of doing change research, is to really think about how I understand context, theoretically and empirically, and how might I study this very important aspect of change, not as this stable background. And in the work that I've done since, I've also been able to see that what I think initially might be the context, the relevant context for this work, that distinction between the change and the context changes as I understand the change process or the aspects of the change process that I'm studying better. I can qualify this relationship between change and context. And sometimes I can also see that to study this specific change in how clinicians work with a specific decision process, I need to focus in and look at, for instance, the consultation as the context. And I can't know this in advance. I need to do the field work in order to qualify how I make this distinction. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah. So this is just from a book I did back in 2019, where we offer a definition of context as this contextualizing that we do. And I think it's such an important thing to remember that we are always doing this when we do research, right? We foreground something and background something else, and that's so consequential. What is it that we're foregrounding and what are we backgrounding and why? So I'm not going to go through this. It's just a framework we did to try to offer ways of engaging with this. But in the first publication, we really talk about the relationship between context, action, and change, and offer ways to operationalize and study this. And in the second publication, we talk about how this phenomenon context relationship changes depending on your focus. And it was a fun publication to do because we used the COVID-19 pandemic as sort of example and show how you can frame the pandemic and change and healthcare in 3 different ways and get 3 very different research projects and focus out of it. Yeah. So I think this is the last one. Some of the main issues and big challenges that I think I've encountered and that I love to talk to you guys about if you're interested is this work to establish the phenomenon change and the context. It's also, I think, the practicalities and very hard work of doing field work in and of changes. And I think that sometimes I wish that this was not sort of edited out of method books as much. I think, at least for me, I had to really think about planning the fieldwork so I had an opportunity to have a little bit of a distance, navigate this distance closeness relationship, plan for pauses. I've done fieldwork where I very optimistically planned to arrive on Sunday night and stay at the hospital and come back Friday afternoon. And that is exhausting. I mean, it's amazing, but it's also exhausting. So I think this is another part of doing change, moving targets to fluffy concept. At least I do when I do fieldwork of change. I spend so much time and so much energy sort of trying to reduce the complexity and stay with my focus. Yeah. And it's an important part of doing fieldwork, I think. Trust your sense of what is weird, interesting, worth pursuing. And of course, that's difficult when you don't have a lot of experience, but then hopefully you'll have people around you who will sort of encourage you to explain why is this, Laura, interesting? Why, Magali, do you think this is worth pursuing? Yeah. I think in change research, you also really need to think about what is this a case of, right? What is the relevant literature for understanding this? There is so much work done already. So where do I position myself within this? And how will I, maybe especially if you're an early career researcher, accept that the work that I can do is partial? I will need to reduce the complexity, and I'll need to choose the stories I focus on and tell, and to whom, right? I think in the beginning of my research career, I was super frustrated when I couldn't relay the richness and depth and amazingness that comes with field work. It took me some time to understand that's not helpful for other people just to overshare. You really need to think about how it is that you also share your work in a way that it's useful, right? It sort of moves back into the conversation. Personally, I also still think that we need more research on the significance of the emergent, unplanned, and everyday, very routine activities. And I think March had this lovely paper, I think it's called Footnotes on Organizational Change, that I keep coming back to sometimes. And it's not as fancy, it's not as sort of prestigious, but I think it's very, very important. And I also think that because change research is very interesting and challenging, I think that we as change researchers, we need our peers, we need our academic community, we need to find our crowd, and we need to find the conversations that we're joining to sort of have this opportunity to get feedback and get help and get sparring, and sort of when you come back from fieldwork and say, I think this might be interesting, but I'm also a little bit overwhelmed, right? This is where you need your peers. So I think that was it for me. I hope you brought some questions. And the room felt quiet. Okay, good. We see someone. I can't see who was the first one to put their hand up, so
I think it's Bex.
There's
I
some
think
hands raised.
Bex. And then we can have Malin, and then we can have David, and then Emil, and then Christian. So you have to remember. Hold on.
thank you,
So
Maggie. Yeah.
we start with Bex.
Yes.
So Bex, please.
My first question is, I find myself drawn to ethnography as a research method and framework. I love the richness, I love the depth. I also know that it is going to slow down the process of my dissertation. So any advice that you can share on how to balance getting good, deep, rich data on complex systems without becoming the person that finds themselves in the never-ending dissertation hellhole would be great.
Okay, that is a great question. Thank you. First of all, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context. So in Denmark, we have 3 years to do a PhD. from we begin till we have to hand it in. So if you do ethnography in Denmark, you have 3 years to start the process, do the field work, do the data analysis, and finish the thing. So I completely relate to this question. It's very, very important, I think. I did ethnographic fieldwork in 4 different hospital units in my PhD. And I did also really need to navigate, how do I do this? I think one of the ways I did that was the pilot study trick, right? It's super easy to give yourself this little section of the fieldwork where you say, this is my pilot study. It's worthwhile data. I'm going to treat it like every other data that I produce, but I need some sort of creative obstruction for myself to focus. So I'm going to do this little bit, and that's going to help me come back to my design, my research question, my assumptions, and help me focus a little bit. I'm a very happy, curious ethnographer, so I need sort of, I need structure, right? Because I could just spend a lot of time in an organization. So I know I need to set myself some structure. I need to say, this is the research question. How do I operationalize this? What am I thinking this might be? Because that will allow me to be a little bit more focused, but also to be surprised with all the stuff that I wasn't able to see. And the only answer I have for your question, Bex, is that prepare for the data analysis. Know that this will take time, but it will also be rewarding. And also maybe know that in my experience, in the data analysis phase, this is where I really needed peers. So I was fortunate to find a writing group with 2 other PhD students. So while we were at the data analysis phase, we would meet, I think, once a month. We would share text with each other and help each other improve. We wouldn't talk about how things were going. And only one person's text was on the meeting for that specific meeting. And then next time, maybe it's David's, and next time it might be Carol's. So that helped me a lot, both as a person who gave feedback and then became trained into reading other people's analysis, because that helped me improve my own work a lot. But also just having the community that helped me in the structure, that helped me progress the writing. Was that any kind of answer?
That was helpful. Thank you.
That's good.
So now this is Marie from Göteborg.
Thank you.
Yes,
thank you.
Your question.
Well, I think I have 7 questions, but I will stick to one because this was a great talk. Thank you so much. We have a close connection, I think, in research. So I would love to talk to you afterwards as well. But because I'm an industrial PhD student, so I'm kind of an ethnographer, not by choice, but by force or something. So, but I'm in my environment or in my context, and I have a question for you then on, because I'm looking at change or digital transformation of public sector, and what I have seen or kind of noticed is that non-actions or inactions are also significant in change, but I haven't found a way to kind of make that claim, or how do I measure inaction, such as waiting or just kind of thinking about something that didn't happen before, and now I cannot do it today because it didn't happen before. So this kind of emergence also of non-action and how that affects what is possible to do, or why you do something today, or have you found a way to find action or non-action as kind of collaborators?
That's a really, really good sort of spot of something that's weird and curious and interesting. We have in my research group, we have a reading group. We call it the organizational sociology reading group, where we study invisibility. So it's the invisibility reading group, because there is a sociological literature for the unmarked, right? For stuff that we don't call action, for stuff that we don't articulate as something we did, or for not doing and not seeing and not listening and not acknowledging. So yes, there's a literature there, and I will be happy to share some of the stuff that we're reading, and I think you might find some of that helpful. That is not necessarily connected to change. So you might have a fantastic opportunity to try to link the different literatures. But I'm guessing that there are change studies out there that have looked at some of this. Yeah. Was that a helpful, Malin?
Thank you. Yeah, it was helpful. And could I just also ask, because I said I'm also struggling with this context versus change, because the context is changing. And I saw your kind of definition of context, and you said people and action. Since I'm in digital, how have you thought about not people? Because you have digital actions that are not people, but machines. So the difference between actor and actions, if actions are not done by people.
Yeah, I think that some of the literature that we're going through, that we're discussing in that book, is also the more A&T inspired, STS inspired literature, where you would just use the word actant and actor, right? Because if in that literature, infrastructure and technology and the way a room is set up, those all do things. Yeah.
Okay, so I will ask for David because he said internet isn't stable. So his question is, how much time minimally do our students need to do fieldwork?
Oh, okay. So how much time do students need to do fieldwork, or how much time is enough time, or?
Absolutely fascinating talk, Nina. Both.
Both, okay. Well, I think it depends a little bit on the question you want to answer and the conditions that you have, right? Because it's absolutely doable to do short-term ethnography, right? But it sort of, your question sort of will help you understand, I think, what it is that you want to study. I could have studied their efforts to produce coherence in less than 3 years, but I had 3 years, and I was very grateful because I could see then that the work of stabilizing, what implementation researchers would call implementing, was also really, really important. And if I had a shorter period of time, I would have had less material on this important aspect of trying to change healthcare pathways into being more coherent. So I think it's a matter of sort of looking at your question, thinking, what am I actually trying to achieve? What is it that I want to study? Do I want to study, for instance, a specific way of working with a new tool and how that might change a decision process? That might not require 3 years, right? But other kinds of questions might call for longer work.
So forgive me, but a follow-up. So how much time did you spend with the write-up, or were you, I'm guessing, writing all the way along?
I was writing all the way around. Yeah, the way I write, I need to write to know what I think. So for me, it's not writing up. I've spent quite a lot of time with the literature and academic writing, so I know that there's a huge and beautiful variety in how we write. People write in so many different ways. So it's also a question, I think, of figuring out what works for you and support that. And for me, it's really, really helpful to start writing as early as possible, and also to start thinking and sketching theoretically when I'm actually in the field. If I have a moment, if I have like 15 minutes before I have to run with someone again, I will maybe draw an outline of a room, and jot down some questions that have occurred to me during the day. And then when I come back, I'll do the sort of more rich field notes into my PC. And that's also a part of the writing. I completely understand the need to sort of have the whole material in order to think, okay, for this paper and for that analysis, that's beautiful, because I can't do that if I'm still in process. So that's maybe a different kind of writing, maybe a little bit more akin to what people call writing it up. I don't know. But my writing on ethnographic work takes time. It takes time.
It absolutely does. Yeah, thank you so much, Tuck.
Okay, now it's Emil, and then it will be Christian, and I guess we have some time for some question next. So if you want to put down. Emil? You wanted to ask a question, so yeah. So now,
no,
just take
thank
it.
you. My question was answered.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay.
Okay. So Christian.
Carol has her hand up, but I'm not sure that she's next in line.
Yeah. So, but we have Christian, and then we will have Carol. It's okay. Okay. So.
Thank you for this wonderful and very interesting talk. I didn't actually have a question, but now I have I was applauding you, but now I do have the floor. I'm gonna make two comments that I think you might want to say something about. And the first is that I'm really struck by your involvement with engaged scholarship, and you go back and you talk to people, right? And that brings into play something that I'm always juggling with, namely the way that we as researchers characterize things and put things in very different boxes than practitioners of all kinds usually do. And I'm guessing that that's an issue that also relates to new ideas about how we should do transdisciplinary research, right? We should engage non-researchers in research. And I'm guessing there's something productively happening there that I would love to hear you say more about. And that relates to another thing that I was thinking about. I often study change, and I very often study sort of conceptually induced change. Now we want more coherence, or we want a new type of healthcare, or whatever, or we want enablement care, or whatever. And I often find that a lot of people, particularly when you get to the bottom of the organization, they don't really relate to that signifier. They have no clue what that means. And either they make up something because they feel they have to, or they simply say, well, this is not relevant to me. I'm going to keep on doing whatever I usually do. And that sort of has, I think, consequences for studying change, and also for your question about what the heck is my case a case of, and what is it really that I'm studying here, right? I hope that was potentially productive, but that was things you made me think about. Thanks.
Oh, those were some great comments. I can share with you my response to the first one. I've talked to so many clinical managers and clinicians and people working in hospitals over the years, and I have found a really interesting pattern, learned a really interesting lesson, is that what they get most excited about is actually when I share with them the organizational theories that might help explain some of the practical problems that they see in their everyday world. And usually they are not socialized into knowing this, right? We couldn't expect that, but and it's some of it is old school, like really, really old coordination theory from the 50s has been some of the stuff that people have been most interested in hear me talking more about. So there are two main mechanisms for coordination. Like there's plan coordination that's really, really works well in stable settings. And then there's the emergent ad hoc, more sort of mutual adjustment coordination that works really well in smaller groups and when the organization is very unpredictable. But hey, our organization is super unpredictable and there's a lot of uncertainty and we have so many standards. Now I understand why I spent so much time doing articulation works. That's the stuff I'm doing from I arrive to I go home. I just thought I wasn't getting anything done. Like, so that's my experience, is that I don't necessarily need to translate theory. I need to relate it. And as an ethnographer, I think we have a huge leg up because we've been in this organization and we can provide them with examples that they will recognize, right? And they will know. Some of the work that, for instance, caught the attention of oncologists was this so from sociology of knowledge or temporality theory, like just the fact that organizations are multi-temporal was sort of, for some of these people who are trained in seeing things that are clinical, was just sort of, this is of course obviously relevant. I can see this. I can see that we have multiple temporal structures, but now I also understand how they are part of the conflictual relationships that we have sometimes. It's not necessarily because McGarley isn't doing what she's supposed to do, it's because we work in different structures, right? So that would be my my response to that, is that not necessarily translation, actually maybe more sort of trying to see how they're two sides of the same coin. That was a very long answer. And then you talked about the relevance, right? The relevance of the change. In this particular project, I shared coordination and lack of coherence in patient care pathways. I didn't need to argue for that at all. All the clinicians were on board with that because they could all see that the work was fragmented and siloed. But I have also been in organizations where the idea for the change was maybe born somewhere else and then arrived with a different sort of logic and set of expectations. Yeah, and that is very impactful for what is it actually that you're studying, right? I agree. That was a good comment.
Thanks. That was very illuminating. Thank you.
So before we go on with Carol and then Constantine, we have a question. Is there a way to receive a copy of the paper, Writing with Resonance?
Yeah, I will. I think it's actually available on my profile. I'll make sure to make a note of that. And if it's not, I'll see if there is some way that I can get an author-accepted manuscript. I think that's what's up there.
Okay.
If not, one has to go through the library resources, and if you don't have access to those, you're challenged. So I always try to put the author-accepted manuscript up so it's open access.
Okay, thank you. And now we go on, Carol. It's up to you. And then Constantine.
Thank you, Nina. This has been incredibly broad and expanding. I have a very simple question. Is ethnography a methodology within participative action research, which is so central to Aalborg, or is it different? How do you integrate the two?
That's a really good question. Why would you think that was simple? Okay, I'll do my best to answer this. I think there are so many varieties of doing ethnography and doing participatory research that you're completely right. It's how you do it. Personally, I don't know how to do those kinds of action-oriented research because I spend all my energy on just understanding what's going on. If I also have to be part of actually trying to change stuff, I think my brain would melt down. But I do work that's very, very participatory in the sense that people are involved. Many different people are involved. Does that give you any kind of...
No, that was the answer. You're really differentiating from the researcher being an active participant in the change. So ethnography is from the outside perspective.
Yeah.
And the participant part is the dual role.
Yeah.
And you're saying it's not a dual role, but it is participatory.
Yeah. I think some people can navigate this.
Oh, people do.
I just can't. I just can't. I think it's because I become very quiet when I'm on fieldwork. I need to think and make notes and understand and observe.
Yeah, I relate to that. Yeah. I believe that Coughlin is very active in this and defines it as an insider action research. So what you're doing as the research is part of your actual work. I think that's the differentiator, inside or outside.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay, and now Constantine, it's up to you.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. A huge aspect of your work is research ethics. So I wonder if you could say something about getting institutional approval from the hospital, but then from your university, maybe the government. But then also, once you've written it and you try to publish your work, you're dealing with journals who maybe in the US or UK who have very different standards and expectations.
Yeah.
How do you navigate that, especially as a qualitative researcher with ethnography, where we enter the field often not knowing what we're even looking for?
Yeah. That's a really good question. So I'm happy that you make the distinction between the sort of formal side of ethics, which are very important, right? And also sometimes just a starting point, but also the practicalities of research ethics when you do ethnography, which is also really, really important, right? So in terms of the sort of institutionalized, if you will, or sort of a formal side of things, our university has an ethics approval committee where we, of course, have to submit our work and it's approved. And the hospital that, for instance, a specific hospital I'm working with will also have their own sort of process that it has to go through. Usually because I work in these collaborative sort of partnerships, I'm not the main sort of person pushing it through the hospital processes. It needs to be the partner inside the hospital that makes sure that all the stuff is important and approved all the way up and all the way back. And that's one part of it. But another part is also then after all the formal ethical applications are done and approved, and sort of you've got this stuff in order and you've thought about GDPR and how you're going to do stuff in the field, then you also have, as an organizational ethnographer in healthcare, you also have to negotiate the terms of your relationship with the operational level. They're rarely a part of the sort of formal process in the hospital. So they might have a hospital that said, this is okay, we agreed to this is fine, we've done all the formalities. Last project I did, it took, I think, months and months. We started in March and we're done in September or something. But I still had to then arrive and talk to the clinical managers and day-to-day staff with them about how is this going to work? How do I usually do when ethnography? What are the terms of doing ethnography with you guys? Like, what are the things that are very important in terms of your specific patient group? And how do we handle these practical ethical decisions that you're going to make on the fly and I'm just going to have to accept, right? Because there's no sort of barging into a sort of a clinical context. You have to just really respect this is what's possible, this is what's doable, and this cannot be part of it. I don't see any other way around it. Was that even an answer to your question? I mean, in the university, we have people that will help us with the formal part, but with the practical part of doing this kind of work, I really hope that early career researchers have a supervisor or someone more senior who's done this kind of work and who will help them understand the kinds of situations that they might be in and the kind of sort of ways of dealing with these situations. And also when you then write your work based on ethnography, you have to make ethical decisions again. You're representing something, right? You're writing, it's your voice, it's your analysis, but you are also sharing something based on someone else's work. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Maybe just to add, and I know we could talk forever on this, and I want to give other people the opportunity to ask. I always found it easier to deal with the hospitals, and it was really more of an administrative matter, getting a signature. Whereas with the universities, it was often the frustration of dealing with people who had absolutely no clue what I was going to do, who came from a very different scientific background and were just against approving something that might be unethical or just, it can't be defined. So I'm not so sure about this. I did my PhD in the UK. I proposed to do a study in the NHS, and it was just not possible. And we're talking like 15 years ago. I then went to Austria, and basically I could put on a white coat and I had an entry to anywhere I wanted to go. So it was very different. And always dealing with universities was much more frustrating than dealing with the hospitals.
Well, that's interesting, right? Yeah.
Interesting and frustrating.
Yeah, of course, also frustrating. Yeah. I think in some senses, the GDPR legislation makes some aspects of this equal, right? But it's also something that's if it's, as you say, if it's a legal department and a university that do not understand the nature of the work that you're doing, it also may be very scary for them to consider that this research actually might be sort of worthwhile, and let's approve this and let's invest in this person's efforts. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. We are at the end of the hour. So thank you everyone for having participated, and also thank you, Nina. It was more than interesting. I think that everybody has enjoyed it, and I have also a lot of questions, so I will send you all of my questions.
I really enjoyed your questions. They were super good. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your participation, and also can you maybe share Nina's closing slide. So because you can join all of us on our in our new LinkedIn profile, and also keep in touch. We will, if you are in all of our mailing list, you will know about all of our next webinar. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to have you. You will receive a follow-up email with the link of the recording and also the link for all of the follow-up. So, and also we want to thank gratitude for our sponsor of the division, the University of Memphis, and also INSEAD, which is a business school for the world. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your participation. We were very happy to host you here. And of course, thank you, Nina.
And as they said in the beginning, Laura and Maglia, if you have any ideas for these kinds of webinars, let us know and we'll see if we can make something happen.